Good evening, everyone. Let me start again. Hello and welcome to the 2026 INP Sharp Lectureship hosted by the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information. My name is Kenzie Birchall. I'm an associate professor at the Faculty of Information, and I'm the program director of journalism for the Department of Arts, Culture, and Media out at our Scarborough campus. I'm your host tonight. Not quite sure what that means, so I'm pretty sure it's the intro, the outro, the hellos, the goodbyes, some chit, some chat, a little later on some of your questions, and then our guests' answers. But before we begin, we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have this opportunity to work on this land. The ENP Sharp Lecture is an annual tradition that offers space for academics and professionals alike to engage with complex ideas and bold questions. Established in 1989, the ENP Sharp Lectureship was endowed by IP Sharp Associates Limited, then a Reuters company, in honor of its founding president and former CEO. After launching the firm in 1964, Sharp transformed it into a global leader, offering early cloud computing services and developing cutting-edge applications. His impact remains felt across the industry, and we're deeply grateful to IP Sharp Associates and Thomson Reuters, whose past generosity makes tonight's lecture possible. This year's lecture, AI at Work, you can cue the impending ominous music, automation, surveillance in the future, or not, of jobs, continues this tradition of thoughtful and timely conversation. So now I'd like to invite Javed Mustafa, Professor and Dean of the Faculty of Information, to say a few words of welcome.
All right. What a group. Thank you so much for joining us this unusually cold late afternoon of May. I'm Javed. I'm originally from the US. I have joined the University of Toronto about 2.5 years ago. And before I sort of launch into my formal intro, I wanted to introduce or reintroduce the iSchool, or the Faculty of Information, to you. I want to say that as you see the number 100, we are not quite there yet. In 2 years, we're going to be 100 years old. It's a very well-rooted, well-established division on campus. We're not in Robarts Library. We're next to Robarts Library. We have our own building. We have a building proudly called the Bissell Building. And I remind parents when they come to me and sometimes say, Javed, you know, I thought my daughter or son would go and become one of those IT whiz kids, but instead they want to go study English. And I say, do you know someone? Let me introduce you to someone called Bissell. Do you know who Bissell was? Bissell was an English professor who basically globalized the University of Toronto, who was the leader of University of Toronto eventually. And he has 2 buildings named after him, not one, on this campus. So hooray for humanities. So iSchool is on a significant growth spurt. We welcome you to come and visit Bissell. We've recruited, give or take, 15 plus new faculty members in the last 2.5 years. We launched a new degree. I am happy to share with you, this was approved at the provincial level, a new bachelor's degree. And we are launching one of the largest renovation projects in the history of the iSchool this year. We are going to have a significant presence at the corner of Sussex and St. George in about 2.5 years. So welcome. Despite the gloom and doom picture, I hope this will be a very stimulating and lively discussion today. I want to say that just as some reflection, the questions before us are just simply technological. Obviously, they are social, ethical, political, and profoundly human. We need to think carefully about what kinds of futures we're building and who benefits from them and who may be left vulnerable. This is why this event matters so much, especially today. It invites us to take a break and reflect, and then take those reflections away to use them in our scholarly and professional lives. For about a century now, the faculty has been preparing people to work in the information field in ways that serve our communities, our institutions, for the public good. Our name, our programs, and our technologies have evolved, but the core questions we pose have remained consistent. How is information created, organized, governed, and used? Who has access to information? And how can we ensure that information practices strengthen rather than diminish democratic and human possibilities? Today's event connects the legacy of IP Sharp's vision with the challenges and responsibilities of the present moment and with the future we are helping to shape at the Faculty of Information. On behalf of the Faculty of Information, thank you for joining us. We are grateful to our speakers, our moderators, our MC, and everyone who has helped make this event possible. I look forward to the conversation ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Mustafa. So today's discussion is sure to spark some questions, and we invite you to ask those during the Q&A portion of the evening. Now, of course, there's an app for that. We'll be collecting questions with Slido, which you can access using the QR code behind me, or by visiting slido.com and entering this code up on the screen. You can submit questions at any time during the discussion and upvote those that you want to see answered by our speakers. Moderating this evening's discussion is Vera Khovanskaya, assistant professor and my colleague at the Faculty of Information. Her research examines the impact of data collection in the workplace, the opportunities and the challenges of data-driven approaches to worker advocacy, and the barriers to worker-centered and community-driven technology design. Please join me in welcoming Vera to the stage, along with our guest speakers of the evening, Yochai Benkler and Karen Levy.
Hello, thank you, Kenzie, and good evening, everyone. I am so excited to introduce our speakers for the evening. I will read some bio introductions and then we'll get started. Yochai Benkler is the Berkman Professor of Entrepreneurial Legal Studies at Harvard Law School and faculty co-director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. He's the author of The Wealth of Networks, celebrating his 20th anniversary soon, an award-winning book widely recognized for its impact on scholarship, public policy, and public understanding of the internet itself. Karen Levy is an associate professor in the Department of Information Science at Cornell University with an affiliate appointment in the Cornell Law School and field faculty roles in sociology, science and technology studies, media studies, and data science. Her research examines the legal, social, organizational, and ethical dimensions of data-intensive technologies, with particular attention to digital rule enforcement, inequality, workplace surveillance, and the use of data in intimate relationships as tools of both care and control. She is the author of Data-Driven, Truckers, Technology, and the New Workplace Surveillance, Princeton University Press 2022. Please join me in welcoming our guests. Welcome to the University of Toronto, and for your two images here with us. When we were initially sort of formulating our plan for this lecture series, we thought about the keywords that you see here: automation, surveillance, and the future of jobs. And we talked about how often these conversations focus on a familiar expectation, almost a kind of inevitable expectation that the systems that are upstream from us will automate jobs in such a way that the role of people is reduced. That the people will lose the jobs. There will be fewer jobs. Will be automated away from jobs. Research on workplace technology systems that are in use today already with automation components in them kind of actually paints a more complicated story than one of reduction. It could be as well a story of reorganization, not that the jobs have disappeared, but that their nature has been reorganized. So the way that work is allocated is different, the way that work is evaluated is different, and the way that people experience their work has changed. And many of the new affordances of these technologies do things that we will talk about in great detail in the conversation to follow, but it's not just reduce. So that's why we're here, to talk about that. And I will ask Karen to start, so please take it away. And then we'll go on to Yochai. All right, deal. And you had mentioned that you wanted to leave the chair. No, we'll not leave the chair. Okay.
All right, I've got two mics actually. Is that what we want to be doing here? Okay. You guys are going to hear me in stereo. Okay. Hi everyone. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to get to meet some new folks and see some old friends. Vera is actually the first person I met when I started my job at Cornell. When I went down for my job interview, she met me at the bus and took me to dinner. So it's a nice full circle moment to get to see her again. And Yochai and I have had the opportunity to be in conversation many times over the last several years, and I always take quite a lot from his perspective on things, so I feel very privileged to be part of the conversation tonight. I am a social scientist and a lawyer by training, and the bulk of my research is qualitative empirical social science, so I like to go into workplace environments and observe what's going on, talk to workers, talk to other folks who are involved in the technological transformation of work. So what I thought I would do tonight is talk to you for a little bit about really two projects that I have done in a little bit of depth, two little case studies, and then share a few more findings from some other studies, just to kind of try to answer this question that Vera posed about how AI and related technologies are reshaping work. I'm going to modify that question a little bit, actually in line with what Vera also said. The focus of my inquiry tends to be about the quality of work, right? So not so much these important questions about economic forecasting about what jobs will be eliminated by new waves of technology. Those are really important questions, but they're not fundamentally my focus. I'm more interested in what happens to workers on the job. And then even more specifically, the bulk of my research really looks at low-wage work. I can explain why I'm most interested in low-wage work if you're interested, but I am. These tend to be contexts where power differentials between workers and firms tend to be quite acute. There's really quite a lot at stake. They tend to be what people sometimes call low-skill jobs. Low skill is, of course, a misnomer if you've ever had one of these jobs, but you can think of these largely as hourly jobs or jobs that don't necessarily require a higher education. That's where I've devoted most of my research energies. And the thesis that I want to try to convince you of tonight is that one way to think about AI and other technologies in the workplace is fundamentally as a reallocator of cost and risk in the workplace. So again, in line with what Vera said, we sometimes think about these technologies through the lens of efficiency, right? The rhetoric around AI tends to be that it helps us to optimize for certain objective functions, or that it helps us to locate inefficiencies or to streamline different business processes. And that's certainly a perspective, but I think from the worker perspective, maybe a more helpful lens, or one that acknowledges the experience of work in a slightly different way, is to think instead about kind of this moving of different costs that don't necessarily disappear, but are relocated often onto workers from firms. So I'm going to tell you two stories quickly. One is about long-haul trucking, and then the other is about the supermarket. And then I'll, if I have time, I'll talk about a few other dynamics in other workplaces. So let me start with trucking. This is a book that I wrote about trucking a few years ago. I've spent more of my professional life than I ever anticipated in truck cabs and at truck stops talking to long-haul truckers about their work. They're a fascinating group of people. I could blather on about them for hours, and I'm going to spare you that. But I just want to give you one kind of tidbit from my research with long-haul truck drivers to kind of get at this point about risk reallocation. I am sure you have all read or seen these types of headlines about the idea that long-haul truckers are really right in the crosshairs when it comes to risk of automation from autonomous vehicles and AI systems, right? A lot of people think this is one of the first jobs that will be eliminated. There are some still fairly small scale, but also somewhat promising technological interventions, some not entirely driverless, but what we might think of as driverless trucks doing some routes now in the United States in a few very specific geographies. So this is kind of the story that you tend to hear about AI and truckers. These are just some pictures I pulled off the internet of what this might look like, right? And you can see that the idea here is really displacement, right? That you don't have a human being behind the wheel of the truck. This image on the right is from a Rolling Stone article. I really like this one in particular because you can see the idea is that there was this human truck male, right? Male trucker is usually the image, and he's quite literally kicked out of the cab, right? He's removed from his means of economic provision. This is the story that we often hear. The story of what's really happening in long-haul trucking with respect to AI is not really this. Instead, it looks more like this. So this is a cartoon that both Yochai and Vera have seen me present this a million times, so you guys can tune out for this part if you'd like to. But this is from a trucking trade publication called Landline that the cartoonist Mo Paul is a friend, and he very kindly lets me use this slide when I present about truck drivers. This is from an article that ran in Landline a few years ago called The Robo Trucker. And you can see this is obviously a caricature of various technologies that were and are on the market that do various kinds of fatigue and attention detection for truckers. Now this is a caricature, right? So these are not real technologies, but the references are actually quite close to real technologies. There's kind of two buckets of technologies that Mo is referencing in that cartoon. One is wearable devices, which is what I'm sort of showing you on the left here. This is just one of many technologies on the market, but this is a wearable hat called a smart cap that runs a constant EEG on truckers' brainwaves, looking for signs of fatigue or disruption, feeds alerts back to the trucker's manager, can send up alerts in the truck cab, and is quite widely used in trucking and in other industries as well. The other technology that I think is an even broader use are AI-augmented camera systems, often trained on the truck driver's face, and looking again for signs of fatigue, things like eyes closing or like your chin nodding, the things that happen when you get tired in the truck. So what I want you to notice about this technology is, first of all, just how distant it is from the story that we tell about what AI is doing in trucking, right? Like, this is not a displacement story. This is a story about a very intimate incursion of surveillance technologies into the work of trucking, right? Often into or onto the trucker's body in a way that is just categorically different from the story that we often hear told about what AI will do in this industry. Another thing that I won't go into this in a bunch of detail just because of time, but it's useful to notice, first of all, you can imagine that long-haul truckers don't love these technologies in the same way none of us would love being subject to these technologies in our own workplaces. It's really seen as quite autonomy reducing, especially for drivers who see themselves as quite professional and safety conscious. We might think, well, who cares, right? Like, if this actually helps people be safer, we all have an interest in public safety on the roadways. Maybe we could say this seems worthwhile. There's basically extremely mixed, trending negative evidence that these technologies actually do anything to augment safety. I'm happy to talk about the reasons that I think that's the case later if anyone's interested. But most importantly, I think for our discussion tonight, what I want you to notice about these technologies is where it locates cost and risk, right, which is on the trucker. So it's no doubt the case that long-haul truck drivers are extremely overworked and very fatigued. That's a real set of problems that these technologies are responding to. But that has to do with the structure of the industry in the United States and to some extent in Canada as well, which is tied to the way that truck drivers are paid. So truckers are paid by the mile they drive. It's essentially a piece rate system. So they internalize a lot of costs for time that they are waiting to be loaded or unloaded, for time that they're stuck in traffic, for time that they're doing inspections, for other things that are part of the job but for which they are uncompensated. And those are the real drivers of fatigue for them. So there would be a way to address this problem by putting some of that cost on trucking firms, right, by requiring that they pay truckers for the time they actually work. Rather than moving the cost to firms, we instead cause truckers to internalize these costs and then do this kind of fatigue detection and monitoring as the sort of Band-Aid tech solution to this problem. So that's one story I want to tell you. The other one, and I feel like I'm making a lot of noise here. The other one is a context that is probably more familiar to most of us. How many of you have used a self-checkout machine in a supermarket before? Perhaps like literally everyone, or nearly everyone in this room. So people are very familiar with this. With my student Pega Marati and a colleague Cristobal Scher, we've been doing a study of what retail self-checkout work looks like in the context of self-checkout as opposed to more traditional checkout. So you probably know, right, if you've used a self-checkout machine, that there are still frontline employees in the store who are often tasked with sort of supervising you when you're doing the work of checking out. We were really interested in what does that work look like for cashiers in terms of the tasks that they're doing and how they are relating to managers and customers. From the outset, it's worth noting that this is sometimes described as an automation technology. It's really not an automation technology, right? Others have made this point too. We call it a pseudo-automation technology because you know that a human being is still scanning all the items. It's just that that human being is you, right? It's not the employee anymore. So it appears like maybe more efficient from the firm's perspective, but that is actually also an offsetting of labor onto the customer. So we're very interested in what does this look like for the human worker. I'm sure you know that when you go through a traditional checkout, what that work looks like for workers is, it's one-to-one, so one worker is working with one customer. The pacing is quite regular, right? You're just working with one person at a time. You have a few minutes of engagement with just that person. Maybe you're making small talk with them, maybe you're not talking to them at all, but it's a pretty regularized and self-paced work task. When you're supervising self-checkout, often a human employee will supervise like 4 to 8 self-checkouts. And the nature of that task is really different, right? So it's much more bursty in how it works, right? So oftentimes nobody needs you, and then all of a sudden maybe 4 to 8 people need you all at once. And when they need you in a very different way from the way they needed you in traditional self-checkout, right? So they are usually needing to interface with a human employee when something has gone wrong, right? When something hasn't, you know this, right? When something hasn't scanned properly, when they need age verification for something, when there's some problem, right? So they are starting with this sort of problem orientation or accusation, and that really fundamentally, that plus the pacing differential, really changes the nature of what this work looks like for those employees. Now the other dimension of it that I did not anticipate when we went into the field to do this study is how adversarial those interactions tend to be, in part because of this problem orientation, and in part because the other aspect of self-checkout is that it is widely considered to be a site where there's a lot of additional shoplifting. There's a bunch of debate about what statistics to believe in this context, but it seems quite clear that stores are much more concerned about shoplifting at self-checkout, maybe by accident if people just don't know what they're doing when they're scanning bananas and they don't know to scan the organic bananas as organic. And sometimes on purpose, right? Sometimes people maybe resent the fact that they're being asked to do this work and they leave the steak at the bottom of the cart and rather than scan it. I mean, we all have to make choices about what's the right thing to do, but there is some discussion about the fact that there's higher risk of shoplifting in these contexts. And because of this, the human cashiers that are supervising self-checkout are charged now not only with helping people in the store, but also with policing people, right? So they have these much more adversarial interactions where they can't accuse people of shoplifting because they still are servicing them. But they also need to try to make sure, and they're specifically instructed that part of their job is to try to keep people from stealing. So in this work, we kind of trace out what this looks like. We call it relational patchworking. This is stemming from research by Sarah Fox and some other researchers who talk about patchwork as the work that workers do around a system to kind of integrate it into the way the workplace needs the technology to function. We talk about relational patchworking because a lot of what these workers are doing is interfacing socially with customers in order to police the interaction without accusing them of stealing. We find that they do this really in two different ways. One is scapegoating the technology. So you might come up to somebody and say, you look like an honest guy, right? Like, I know you weren't trying to steal the steak. You wouldn't do that. But, you know, this computer seems to think that there's a steak in the bottom of your cart. You know how computers are, right? And that's how they sort of save face in the interaction, right? They don't accuse, but they do their job. The other thing that employees do is called what we call hyper-servicing, which is what somebody described as customer servicing them to death, right? So just, you know, being right up in there, right up next to the customer saying, can I help you do this, can I help you do this, in a way that makes clear that you are watching what they're doing. So again, what we see here is not really displacement. Like, we can't really find evidence that these workers are not, they're still doing a job. But the nature of that job has really changed a lot. So labor is both offset onto customers, and they now are tasked with this much more adversarial set of tasks related to this new policing role. Now, a couple other things I'm going to touch on just very quickly. I don't know how much time I have. Do you know? Well, I don't have 42 minutes. Okay, well, I'll talk for just a couple more minutes. Just a few other things that I'll present with much less depth, but I'm happy to talk more about them if people are interested, that sort of, I think, align with this idea of reallocation of cost and risk that we see in low-wage workplaces. One dynamic that's been at play for probably about 10 to 15 years is what's sometimes called just-in-time scheduling. I see a few people nodding, so maybe people are more familiar with this. This is the idea that if you treat labor as an input, right, you have some optimal level of labor, mostly this is for hourly employees, that you want to allocate in a retail setting or in a food service setting. So you don't want to overstaff your store because that's wasting labor dollars. You also don't want to understaff your store because then you're potentially leaving money on the table that your customers might spend if there are long lines, for example. So as a result, companies will try to staff at an optimal level and to be very responsive to real-time data about potential customer demand. What this has resulted in, and there's lots of good empirical evidence on this, is often the set of just-in-time scheduling practices that is really quite unlivable for workers. So this may be things like on-call shifts where you're required to show up to the McDonald's, but you're not allowed to clock in until there's a certain amount of demand, customers in the store. It might be short shifts or split shifts where you work a couple hours, then you clock out, then you clock back in for the lunch rush. It might be only learning about what shifts you're likely to have to work 24 hours before, right? There's a wide variety of different scheduling practices that fall into this bucket. There's been really quite a number of states and cities that have responded to this with what are called fair scheduling laws to try to push back against this problem. But you can see how this sort of falls into the bucket of something that looks really efficient from the firm's perspective, right, from the store's perspective, but really is just outsourcing all of this risk and cost onto the worker who now has trouble regularizing their schedule, keeping a second job, getting childcare, all these other things that don't show up on the books for the store but are still real costs. A couple other things I'll just comment on very quickly. One is the rise of algorithmic wage setting, or what is sometimes now called surveillance wages, which is setting labor prices in ways that are, again, responsive to customer demand or to worker behavior. So you see this most frequently in contexts like rideshare, right, where maybe a rate is set in a very variable way that's personalized to the worker. There's a lot of interest in the rise of these practices and ways in which this also kind of reallocates risk onto the worker, can reduce collectivization and bargaining power. And then finally, something I've been starting to keep an eye on is task redefinition in the workplace. So we have there are certain components of what you have to do for work that are uncompensated, right? So like your commute, for example, right? If you have an hourly job, your drive to the workplace or the time you take to put on your uniform is most likely uncompensated. And there's labor law that talks about what specific work tasks should be compensated. So there's always these kind of residual tasks that you do and they're uncompensated even though you really have to do them in order to go do the more, what is sometimes called the indispensable component of the work. The concern that I have is that as we collect more data about what customers are doing and what workers are doing, it's increasingly easy to sort of carve up work tasks and make them more granular so that you are only compensating smaller parts of the pie, right? So we already see this with rideshare drivers, for example, who are paid only for the time that they have a passenger in the car, but are not paid for the time that they're driving to pick up that passenger, or not paid for the time that they're keeping the car clean, for example. We see it in some other contexts too, like musicians, for example, now are compensated when people listen to their songs for a certain number of seconds, right, as opposed to in this kind of coarser form of compensation where people were paid for the number of units that they would sell. Even Amazon was experimenting, I don't think they do this at scale, but was experimenting with something where their ebooks, they would only compensate authors for the number of pages that people actually read using the ebook. People don't like that one. But those are the types of things that I think we will see more and more of as it becomes possible for firms to externalize those costs back onto workers. Okay, very last thing I'll say. So I've obviously focused on the low-wage workplace because that's my area of interest, but I imagine a lot of people in this room are interested in what's going to happen to more professionalized workplaces. I'm recognizing this is way too small for you to see, but that's okay, I'll just tell you what it says. I've done a little bit of comparative work looking at different types of workplaces, so the retail context and commercial vehicle inspection, which relates to the trucking context, and comparing that to retail pharmacy, along with my colleague Liz Chiarello, who has studied retail pharmacy and the relationship between surveillance and those workers. And I think we have some suggestive evidence that in more professionalized workplaces like pharmacy, we may actually see that those workers are able to use technologies in ways that support their interactions in the workplace and make the interactions with customers less adversarial rather than more adversarial. If people are interested, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about her work, but I do imagine that in some contexts where workers have more protection, more professional norms, have more education, et cetera, we may see some variability around some of the trends that I've described. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention is some work out of Stanford about what's sometimes called work slop. So this is the idea that in office-type settings, as workers use generative AI to generate documents, slide decks, et cetera, that appears very efficient. But what these researchers point out is that it's, again, only efficient from one perspective. It's pretty inefficient from the perspective of the person who then has to quality check your work, this is this phenomenon they call work slop, and they document that other people in the firm spend a lot of time doing quality control, checking your work, checking your hallucinations, et cetera, and they document kind of how this has both a relational cost and a time cost that is sometimes unattributed in conversations about generative AI. So I will stop there and pass it over to Yochai, but thanks for letting me share some of my work.
Okay, great. Thanks, Karen, and thank you, Vera, and thank you all for inviting me. We're going to actually shift now from the microscope of the qualitative social scientist to the 30,000-foot view from theory and history of capitalism. We live in a world of tremendous opposites and deep social and political dislocation. A world of opposites, a period of crisis. And the basic question is, what are the dynamics that explain these recurring patterns now over more than 300 years of dramatic material growth, social dislocation, want amid plenty, and ecological collapse and political conflict? What do these tell us about the dimensions of struggle, the paths of development that we're likely to see? Essentially, I'd say, how do we leverage theory and history to extract signal from the incessant, noisy present that shows up every day on our front page? At a 30,000-foot level, if we try to understand what is capitalist society, it's a society not with markets. There have been societies with markets since antiquity. It's a society in which markets have near universal market reach. It's where most people live in households that have to sell something in order to buy to subsist, where most organizers of production have to buy labor, knowledge, tools, dealing with time and uncertainty in markets, and where the political military formations depend on selling debt into financial markets in order to be able to maintain their fiscal ability, thereby subjecting their needs to those of the capitalists and rentiers who buy the rents. This creates an incessant dynamic of instrumentalization of social relations, of time, of knowledge, of our very being and relations with each other, and create what I call the Red Queen dynamic. That here you see it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get anywhere somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. The point is not market as choice, but market as imperatives that continuously drive both innovation and dislocation. The great theorist of innovation, Joseph Schumpeter, looked at half of this dynamic. The incessant pursuit of power to escape competition and become a price maker rather than a price taker is what drives innovation. But profit-seeking organizations are indifferent between whether they get a slice of a bigger pie or simply a bigger slice of the same pie. Power and productivity are substitutes as well as complements. And as Thorstein Veblen said, business sabotage is as much a source of profit as increased technical efficiency. And so we see power-seeking technological change against workers, against competitors, against suppliers, and power-seeking culture change in order to obtain power over consumers and shape their demand to what is more profitable. And this has been the case at least since the 17th century. This is my current project, is really a history and theory of capitalism. So if we look at the two quintessential technologies of the Industrial Revolution, Crompton's spinning mule and Arkwright's watermill, the spinning mule was every bit as quantitatively effective and produced finer thread from the start. But for 15 years, Arkwright's watermill continued to be the dominant technology and the one that people today still think of as the original factory, because the watermill could use unskilled women and children who had less choice and whose wages could be squeezed lower. And the spinning mule, because of its structure at the time, required men who were quickly organized and had wages that were 1.5 to twice as much as the women and the children. And for 15 years, the spinning mule had to become 5 times finer in the thread before it eventually completely outcompeted the watermill. This is the fundamental challenge. Both of these things then enable market dependence for protection, and I'm going to quickly move on that through the state and struggles of the state, power seeking also passed through law, through racialization and gendering of relations, through international relations and geopolitics, through financialization. But that's not our focus here today. Our focus here today is specifically on the fact that all technological change involves class struggle. All technological change involves struggle over who controls knowledge in production. All production has embodied knowledge in the body of the workers, has embedded in technology, and has codified knowledge for management that can be expressed. And the proportions of that kind of knowledge in each kind of work shapes asymmetric distribution of power. The way to think about class that allows us to do that is to add to the dimension of most classical understandings of class as being focused on property, to understand that there's a dimension of property having to do with whether the work is manual or cognitive, and the quotient of the work. And once we see that unskilled or semi-skilled and craft or skilled workers have always been different classes whose production as a working class is a production overcoming the fact that they have fundamentally different levels of control. That the professional class is different from the clerical class, even though they all do cognitive work. And so this gives us a much richer understanding of the structure of class, which is what changes in technology and production alter in terms of distribution. Crucially for us, the struggle over knowledge, which is what's involved with respect to AI, focuses on embodied knowledge creates the craft workers or the skilled workers versus the semi-skilled, and we saw in Karen's description of the truckers some of the de-skilling that's going on in these. It's what distinguishes the professional class. The codified knowledge is what makes for the professional and managerial class, whereas embedded knowledge, knowledge embedded in material things and technology, is the only thing that can be subject straight out to property and in control of the capitalist. So how the techno-institutional structure locates the knowledge shapes class position and class power, and that's the schema along which we can then move to start to look at how the specific implementations of technologies play out. The second thing to remember is that we have had major techno-institutional waves every 50 to 60 years since the 18th century. The standard Kondratiev wave in the Schumpeterian literature cycle starts with the first British Industrial Revolution. My own work persuades me that it extends really to 6 or 7 decades before that. But essentially what happens is when a technology diffuses, new entrepreneurs, if it's Schumpeter, or finance, if it's Minsky and Carlota Perez, is looking for someone who can have a new technology that will give them market power, that will allow them to extract rates. They then move forward. There's never an equilibrium. There's always a moving forward, and it takes about 50 or 60 years, and we've had these. And each of these is not just a technological change. It's a restructure of institutions, of the social roles, and therefore of the power that happens in real history on the base of the background of the inherited institution. So it doesn't hit every society in the same way, because in every society, every new wave is not just one technology that's technically neutral. It is a techno-institutional structure that reflects the already inherited power relations from the way it worked last time, which is why we get variation between different societies in how the particular implementations are. There will be a test at the end on every word. What I'm trying to do here is show you that essentially every 70 years there's been a wave, and crucially, these things in the yellow on the side, every one there have been technologies whose primary benefit has been to shift power, like the water frame, as opposed to the mule that I gave you as an example. In every single one of these transitions, major technological breakthroughs have had that particular character, that they shifted power at least as much as they increased productivity. This is the British Industrial Revolution. We have the second wave. The third wave is what's sometimes called the second industrial divide, the growth of large-scale industrialization. And then at the bottom there is the most recent one, the retrenchment to neoliberalism and the shift to information and information technology and communication technology in terms of the technology, but also the fissuring of the workplace, the spreading of manufacturing across global supply chains. In each of these, there have been differences between different societies depending on the relative power of labor, the relative power of capitalism, the kinds of cross-class coalitions that were able to be done, so that the spinning mule was built differently in Lancashire than in Glasgow or Lowell because there were different alignments of power, one that preserved male unions, the other that used women and children, and later immigrant women in Lowell, across different places. If the current Kondratiev, if the current wave that is starting now, whose carrier sectors are AI and energy transformation, will be more or less like the second industrial divide at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, we are in for an entire social transformation. If you think of 1870 to 1940, essentially the period where the transformation of the world resulted in some of the world's greatest conflicts, you understand that talking about AI as normal technology, when you think of normal as the prior rounds, can still mean a transformation of social life and a complete dislocation of social life and geopolitics. And we need to think of it as a social challenge across the board rather than the specifics of a technology. Fundamentally, we need to think, if we think of it at the micro level, firms get to choose whether they are how much they're focusing on productivity, seeking changes in institutions, technology, and ideology, how much they're looking at strategic rent seeking. And they do this in relation to workers, to consumers, to competitors, to suppliers. So if we just focus on the technology side, we can talk about extractive technology vis-a-vis consumers. So Shoshana Zuboff with surveillance capitalism, Julie Cohen, on-demand shaping technologies, but also citizens when we talk about disinformation and the way in which people understand and are shaped. The concentration and price disciplining based on competitors, but particularly today we're talking about workers, about labor homogenizing technologies that try to take work that has embodied knowledge and put it in the machine in order to make the workers more displaceable, labor monitoring technologies and labor organization disrupting. The classic works here, Harry Braverman, David Noble, Sam Bowles. In the current round, Karen shows up every time I present this because her work on the context of control was one of the very earliest pieces on this in this round, already, what is it, a decade? There's work on algorithms at work, there's work on labor disruption. Mary Gray and Suri on ghost work was central to look at the global distribution of labor in this. The crucial thing is to think about two things. The first is what Karen really focused on, which is the automated management and surveillance, which is primarily a focus of pushing work that requires embodied knowledge of skilled workers who therefore have power over their knowledge down to becoming unskilled or semi-skilled, and significantly controlling manual, semi-skilled, and clerical workers in precisely the ways that Karen described of externalizing, I wouldn't call it the risk, the cost of normal fluctuation of business onto the workers so that the workers bear the cost. It's not so much efficient as it is profitable. Things can be profitable without being efficient in any useful sense. And that's really where we're seeing robotics and automated management and surveillance. Interestingly here, because robotics and automated management and surveillance have been around for longer than the current crop of LLMs, if you look, this is perhaps the most, famous is Acemoglu and Restrepo basically saying more robots, reduce wages, and reduce work, uses only American data. But since 2018, we've had a series of papers looking at European robots, and the answer is systematically the opposite. There is increase in productivity, there is increase in wages, there is maybe unclear increase in jobs as well, or no impact on jobs. The most recent two specifically talk about increase in robot intensity, increasing wages and jobs, particularly when exposed to China, essentially a form of reshoring, intensifying reshoring, and across the European Union, the overwhelming majority of model specifications and assumptions show positive impact on jobs. So what does that tell us? First and foremost, different institutional frameworks with different historically specific configurations of power have the same technology resulting in opposite results. And it's not as though the US is a leader in robotics. The US is a laggard in robotics, both in terms of using it and in terms of producing it. It doesn't even appear in the top producers. So then, what about the kind of monitoring technologies? This is the OECD employer survey. What's crucial and what I circle here is that even though automated algorithmic management software is used both in Europe and in the US, the kinds of uses are different. And the biggest differences are monitoring the speed of work and sanctioning workers. And so again, the issue is when labor is organized, when the labor market is socialized, and there's large-scale sectoral bargaining and there's large-scale rule, the same technology isn't used in the abusive way. So for example, the time distribution, the time allocation technology that you're describing could be used to improve work-life balance. Whether it is or isn't, it's not the technology that says you have to sit here for 2 hours while there's no traffic and I won't pay you. The technology can also tell you, you can go home and take care of your kids for 2 hours and come back. It's just a question of who has the power to decide how it's done, and that power doesn't come from the technology itself. Harumph. The patterns are different, I just said that. This isn't about cuddly capitalism being behind. If you look at productivity growth, average annual productivity growth, the two in red are the centers of the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. They're not totally dominated by the others, but they're also not dominating. They're interspersed between the various Christian democratic and particularly in green there, Nordic social democracies have had roughly similar. So you're not gaining productivity by being nasty and exploitative to workers. In many senses, you're even losing productivity. And the critical thing to think of is that there are high road and low road. There are cooperative and non-cooperative paths to innovation. You can actually implement technology with forward-thinking, creative workers who are invested in making the technology their own. But that will only happen under conditions where the employers don't have easy, low-road strategies, and where the workers can actually depend on being able to share in the gains of the cooperative gains. And the non-cooperative solution, the low-road solution, is the one that happens when you have a liberal oligarchy like the United States undermining all of the worker protections in such a way that some players can begin to defect and may increase their profits by undermining the workers, and that then puts the pressure. Remember, it's not about badness and choice, it's about imperatives of market and structural imperatives. Now I can start to talk. I'll highlight a few things and then we can come to them because I think I should be done. Looking at LLMs specifically, software at the moment, particularly in the last 3 or so months, maybe 6, but more even 3, we're beginning to see a shift quickly from vibe coding to agent teams, suggesting a real pressure. This might be a space where there's real displacement in the number of workers, and this is, to me, the projection of an AGI capitalist utopia as the concrete. This is a place in which, if you think of the valuations of the AI firms, they reflect the promise of at long last squeezing labor to zero and being able to pocket all of the gains from production for the capitalists and their rentiers, minimizing even the role of professional managerial class. That's what's being capitalized in these crazy valuations now. The fundamental weakness is that who's going to buy whatever is produced? Where are they going to get the money? If you talk about universal basic income, who is going to be taxed? You really think that the capitalists, once they actually succeed in achieving this, will let the government tax them to the point that everybody can buy enough to maintain aggregate demand? It's a fundamental macroeconomic death spiral whose outcome we know. We saw it in the 1930s. We're seeing its dawn today. There's a PMC-led model. That's what we're beginning, the professional managerial class-led model. That's what we're beginning to see in law today, where an incumbent generation of professionals essentially become the capitalists. They squeeze down some of the young professionals to keep them into permanent journeyman standards. Some escape to becoming smallholders, essentially using the technology to be able to do more than they could have done as solo practitioners or small groups, but also upskilling some of the clerical class workers to becoming a new class of paraprofessionals. And the results are more ambiguous because depending on how many of the less skilled knowledge workers become upskilled and actually can provide, whether it's legal services or whether it's advanced practice practitioners in medicine who can provide greater access to medical services, greater access to legal services, the actual macroeconomic effect really depends on how much this model will allow for upskilling of a much larger number of people or not, which depends then on the institutional structure, on the relative power of this class of workers, and on the active role of the state. We can also have a capitalist version model, which we're beginning to see today with private equity-owned physician services, where essentially you see the physicians being squeezed out and moving to small holding models that themselves are owned by the private equity. You do see upskilling of clerical, but the focus is on the high-paying procedures. And so depending on the particular area of medicine, if it's something where there's a lot of intervention that is highly compensated, like cardiac care, you actually see very good quality of care services. If it's something that is more low-level, long-term care, then you see significant reduction in quality because they're not investing because of the payment. So profit becomes the driver of the outcome, displacing professional ethics and professional responsibility as the driver of care. Ideally, what we need is a social democratic model, and we're beginning to see various countries moving to public AI, to public investment in AI. To my taste, we need to focus on building a compute development bank that will allow actual subsidized compute access to models of cooperativism, models that build workers into it. We need to socialize the continuous dislocation of knowledge and essentially create cradle-to-grave continuous lifelong learning and retraining to deal with changes and opportunities. We need meaningful decommodification of access to basic goods, not as UBI, but as a way of preserving power to starve the low-road strategies from the flow of workers who are desperate enough to accept them. Only in this way do we get a dynamic wage and export-led model of macroeconomic growth. So if you look at this list, which we can go back to later in the conversation, I'm not going to break. This is Darren Osamoglu, author, and Simon Johnson, just from February, coming up with the list. This is the most progressive mainstream economic list, and it's about investing in policy and healthcare, and it's about improving government expertise in AI and redesigning tax policies not to punish providing labor. These are all excellent ideas to create pro-worker AI, but the fundamental point is that if AI and energy are like the larger of the waves we've seen, all of these technology-specific fixes are wholly inadequate. There needs to be a whole-of-society transformation precisely in the way that we saw in the 1930s and 40s to pick up the pieces from the devastation of the period between the two world wars that ended the Third Kentucky. And it's really only through this shift towards a far more intensive social democratic embedding of market relations that that is at all possible in order to shift us to a high road model of dynamic stability.
Going on. We have 10 minutes for my questions, and then how much time do we have for audience questions? So much time. So you guys are on the long end of the bargain. Get your questions ready, and there's the Slido link, which I will advertise to you. I alluded in the bio to a book published 20 years ago. I could do a question for Yochai and then a question for you, Karen. This book, The Wealth of Networks, If you are not the Dean of the Faculty of Information and are not in possession of 2 copies of this fantastic book, the main argument of the book that you argued was that networked social production would transform markets in a way that would increase freedom. And at the time, this is a very, very short summary of the book, sorry. The liberal political theory that you offered was attacked, I think, maybe it's fair to say, both from the left and from the sort of, I guess we could call them the center, market center.
The neoliberal.
The neoliberal center. The market, on the left, the critics are worried that the participation, openness, and peer production would be maybe readily absorbed into capitalist capture rather than becoming a durable site of democratic power. Market liberal side, law and economics side, critics worried that perhaps you had overstated the scale and incentives of common-based production, something that works primarily in the margins, and the large-scale innovation would still require strong property rights, other sorts of incentives. I don't know. If you found yourself transported back in time, knowing everything that you know now, how would you reckon with this sort of situation with all of the wisdom that you've gained since?
Where do you go wrong? Confess.
I could not resist.
The argument in brief for those who haven't, who don't know, was that for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, the most important material means of production were widely distributed in the population: computation, storage, communications, and that made it possible to create a new mode of production, one that was voluntaristic, cooperative, shared. I did early work on free and open source software. I think mine was the first academic reference to Wikipedia as a mode of production. It was certainly a long time ago, long before the book. But you correctly described the way it's interpreted. I always said it would be a struggle, that there was a question of political economy, that capital would try to enclose it. And then I'd say about 12, 13 years ago, Eric Olin Wright, a great Marxist sociologist, invited a whole bunch of us to think about real utopias. And I was still using the same examples that I was 15 years before. And really what you see here is the result of my sense of needing to go back and understand the underlying dynamics of the resilience of capitalism to overcome. And so what would I have done differently? At the time, I was deeply disaffected with the neoliberal state. I was looking for a solution that would be cooperative, mutualistic, and therefore independent of the failures of the capitalist state. And I realized that that's not feasible. So today, I'm looking for this combination of how can state power be leveraged to make a more decent and dynamically stable society.
Karen, I have a question for you about control. And a lot, so we had sort of talked about a familiar framing. There's a familiar framing that AI automation will lead to a reduction in jobs. We're used to this framing. I think we're also used to a kind of framing of workplace control that begins with managers watching workers, managers measure workers, managers tell workers what to do, kind of like command and control version of control. And then there's a pick your own adventure of whether that's the whole story or whether it's not the whole story of control. I think this narrative has unfolded for at least half a century since the publication of Braverman's book that I think is foundational to many of us here. But the command and control narrative in your work on the truck drivers is only part of the story of what control could look like. I think the control theory of control is much more expansive. Control is not only supervision from above, it also works through information flows, through law and compliance systems, and oftentimes it's sort of negotiated in ways that aren't tasking workers with taking on instructions from management. It's sort of more like leaving them to work out the details, while something else has been kind of pre-calculated or pre-stabilized from above. So I'm wondering how you as a theorist came to reckon with a kind of broader form of control that isn't sort of just the supervisory one, and how has that informed your assessment of reorganization of work context?
Question.
I know,
Big question.
control more than control.
No, I mean, I think, so just a couple impressions. One is, I think, through recognition with what Yochai was talking about the importance of social relations and culture and ideology, I think, as key components of how workplaces are organized and how it is that people interact within them. So in the trucking context, without overloading you with detail, truckers sort of participate, or have historically participated in what is sometimes called self-sweating, right? They have historically, because of the way that the industry is structured and because of economic need and because of culture and ideology, sometimes participate in making decisions that ultimately benefit firms to their own detriment. And there's much we could say about how kind of the mechanisms through which that happens, the ways in which firms encourage that kind of internalization. People have written about this in other workplaces too, the kind of gamification, the creation of kind of intra-class competition as opposed to inter-class competition. All of these, I think, are part of it, and do kind of complicate the story of what you described, where it's just the simple top-down, I'm watching you and I'm going to tell you what to do. The other part of it, I think, is also in recognition of what Yochai was talking about, the variability and complexity of relationships between differently oriented people within a work environment. So I've been very interested in kind of this tripartite relationship between workers, customers, and managers, and ways in which data about customers sometimes is used by managers to supervise workers, which is, again, not the path that we would traditionally think of, but is another way, right, in which this control can happen. So I guess the short answer would be it sure is complicated, and there sure are a lot of mechanisms. I think I think it's useful to build on top of what we have known for 50 years about how control works in workplaces and how technology supports that, but that there are always new pathways that maybe have been reckoned with less too.
This question, which may or may not be our last question, is for both or either of you. I think there is a 20th century critique that has taught us to see that centralization is a danger. Command and control, bureaucracy, scientific management, de-skilling, surveillance is sort of a result of a big system. Big system bad. Big system bad. But both of your talks suggest that decentralization also can be bad in the ways that it stabilizes market control while pushing the uncertainty, risk, conflict, responsibility downward to workers, users, households and communities. What made that visible to you, and what kinds of institutional moves would make room for a kind of good decentralization that isn't simply the risk-shifting one?
You want to go first this time?
No pressure.
The piece I mentioned from 12 years ago, which was called Practical Anarchism, Peer Mutualism, Market Power, and the Fallible State, was exactly a struggle with what do you do when not only are you disappointed with large-scale incumbent industrial information economy characters, and not only are you disappointed with the fallible state, but it turns out peer mutualism suffers from its own limitations. And I think the only feasible answer is to find a load balancing between these systems. It turns out that a fully decentralized scale does not work in the teeth of resistance and resilience from concentrated capital enclosing it and encapsulating it. So we have no choice but to find some mechanism of leveraging state power to counter the power of capital, knowing that it is also not the panacea that people maybe 70, 80, 90 years ago thought about. So what are models that we know work? If you look at tripartite and bipartite models of labor relations, where you have the state as a convening and generalizer, the unions at the sectoral level negotiating with the employers at the sectoral level, you have relatively high-scale organized negotiation. You have the state to generalize it in a sector to people who aren't organized. You have below the floor that is set in the sectoral level, higher levels at the individual plant. And essentially what you try to do is you try to create not a fully centralized, I mean, for example, one of the biggest sources of resistance to the European AI Platform Work Act is actually the Swedish unions who want to preserve the voluntarism of their system because they don't think one size will fit them, and they think they can negotiate with their employer associations better over these questions of AI and management. And so that, I would say, is a model, and there are different versions in different countries for how it's done, but a model that essentially identifies a sufficiently large scale unit that has the power to actually make the results stick, that is not higher than that to centralize, but no lower than that to just be, and that requires an understanding of the conditions of the distribution of power, and it won't be the same in every society given its inherited powers, but it's the minimal unit that has the power to make the resolution stick without losing control with the ground level question, with the ground level knowledge of what's at stake and what happens with different solutions.
Yeah, very fast. The only thing I would add is, I was talking about this just before we came up here. I spent a couple days a few weeks ago in a symposium about what sometimes is called surveillance pricing and surveillance wages, right? The idea that data about people is used to set the price you pay for a plane ticket, or increasingly for your groceries or some other good. And then on the wage side, I alluded to this, right? Like the amount that you're paid to take a passenger in an Uber. This has been deployed in like nursing as well, right? So it's not just platform, what we think of as platform-based work, but other forms of labor as well. And you know, in beginning to think about this problem, one of the things that I think is really striking is that so it's decentralized, it's individuated, and even the knowledge of what wage you are being offered or what price you are being offered is extremely atomized, right? Such that building collective knowledge, there's just now starting to be some interesting empirical information showing that, you know, the Instacart price for grapes is completely variable depending on who you are and which browser you're using and what, you know, data brokers have about you, you know, with a huge degree of variability. And that type of information, I mean, that's decentralization in a way, but what's really critical is being able to build some collective, you have to build collective knowledge to build collective power. And so I think, you know, one of the most important areas on both the wage and the price side will be, you know, countering this like very strongly centralized information collection about consumers and about workers and their reserve prices with some power on the other side.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, for a word from our audience members that will be articulated by Kenzie.
Oh, wow, folks. You have a lot of questions. This is quite difficult. I'm excited, though. And I'm doing one of the academic sins. I'm going to ask more than one question at once, because a lot of the questions seem to touch on the same topic. So I've got 3 rough groups so that we can get to the reception, because someone also said, hey, I'm hungry. Okay, I don't want to spill my water. So the first one, this one's long. Just glom onto and choose whatever part speaks to your interests. So we talked a lot, or I heard a lot from you, the three of you actually, about the shifts in power and risk and responsibility. I'm trying to read my own writing as well as the iPad here. And we had so many questions that positioned that same analysis from a personal perspective. Someone working in a head office who wants to know how best to advocate for colleagues and workers in the face of management who wants to automate. Someone else asking, how can workers and employees realistically resist changes from management? How can they advocate for their own rights? Another person asked, how can universities or other institutions or organizations like universities deliberately encourage and help democratize the knowledge being created and or shared through these systems? And this then really comes down to such a qualitative question. If AI is evaluating every choice, then every choice about professional judgment, what's left? And what counts as good work in the first place? Good luck.
I mean, that's a chunky one. I have just two quick thoughts that are responsive to pieces of that. One of them is I really liked the phrasing that you used of the high road solutions and the low road solutions. I am perpetually trying to encourage firms to adopt high road solutions, so far with very little luck. But I do think there is almost a business case to be articulated, well, it's not almost, there is a business case to be articulated for worker respecting technology deployment if you take a long view, right? Like if you believe that retention of employees matters, if you believe that buy-in from your employees matters, if you believe that your workers are not your adversaries, but that you may actually be aligned in some of your goals. Obviously, structurally, there are a lot of impediments to firms taking on that view, but some of them still do. And worker voice is obviously really critical as a precondition for that. But I do think, I mean, for the question of sort of advocating within workplaces about this, I think there have been some really interesting examples in trucking and in retail and in other contexts where there are some employers that I think about high quality workplaces as contexts where they want workers to want to work there. The other quick thing I'll say with respect to kind of what does the future look like, or what are some policy levers, I am very committed to the idea that tech policy should mostly not be about tech. Maybe this is in line with the Asimoglu, Otter, and Johnson perspective. We have tried many times to predict what technologies are likely to emerge and how exactly they're going to affect workers, who's going to lose their jobs, what are the pathways, what kind of retraining is necessary, et cetera, and then to formulate policy in very specific ways to be responsive to those perceived developments. And we've been wrong many, many, many times. And in my view, the best tech policy is policy that lifts the floor, right? That is kind of agnostic as to whether AI comes for your job or not, but that we won't be sorry for having done, right? And that can take the form of, again, these things that often don't look like tech policy, but look like support for basic research, decoupling healthcare from employment, supporting K-12 education, right? These kind of things that we know to be good and which are helpful to workers in the event that they are negatively impacted by technology, but also that if we're wrong, like we're not wasting a lot of resources or misdirecting them.
A couple of different things. I think the first is, while I completely agree with you that there are firms that take on the high road models, and there's a whole literature in business school literature on high commitment, high performance organizations, on good jobs. Fundamentally, to me, the implication of the Red Queen dynamic is that it's not about choice and goodwill. It's about imperatives and who gets competed out in the market. And so the problem is not ill will or goodwill, the problem is changing the imperatives. It's a matter, it's a competitive game, and the way in which you force high road is to make it expensive to go low road. That means changing labor laws to a level that makes it easy for employees to organize against. That means raising the floor of what subsistence we owe each other as members of a society, so that you don't have to accept a job that's a bad job. That only leaves the option of having a good, the only profitable option being a good job. So the answer, I think, is, and I have many colleagues at the business school who are invested in changing capitalism from the inside through what firms will do, and I think the answer needs to be, but that's why we need, in some sense, the state. So that's one part. The second part, with respect to universities, the question on universities, I'd say two things. First, universities remain an institution, however in battle, able to bring to bear technical knowledge and a cohort of invested engineers, researchers, capable of pursuing research in the public interest. And I think that the initiatives we're beginning to see, some here in Switzerland probably most advanced, and in Japan most advanced, of trying to produce a national public AI system as a network of both new publicly funded computation resources combined with existing repurposed and integrated university computation resources together with university research communities to begin to develop models and sustain them in a way that then doesn't require dependence on the profit-driven development as an alternative pathway. And that's one role that universities can play. The second role is that I think we need to overcome the nostalgia of how things were before LLMs came along. And we need to teach ourselves and work with our students to learn to become the best users of the new tool set and continuously learn how to become the best tool set and not be in fact, and certainly not be perceived, or much more important, not in fact, be the ones who are standing and just saying, we're losing our ability to think, we're losing our ability. We need to learn how to think with the new world because our students won't have the choices of not doing it. And so we need to be very nimble with our educational strategies. And the last thing is we need to resist the tendency of university administrations to think efficiently as though they're businesses, rather than strategically as though their role in society is the secular priesthood.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we've almost started, we can applaud. We've almost started speaking to the next question. I know nobody likes to make predictions, but this is something that came up from a number of parents in the audience, a father of two teens, but also a number of students in the audience. And some of you from law, some of you from critical information policy studies. I see you, faculty of information students, some from UX design, more high school students, yes. And then from another parent, so they were asking, what should we do in those first 5 years on the job market? And another parent asking, should I worry about whether my kids will ever have a job?
You want to take this one? I mean, I'm not, famous last words, I'm not really worried about people, like, so the discussion of the demise, the mass demise of jobs is something that has been many times over and that we have not yet seen, and I'm not an economist, but I think there's plenty of work to do. There's plenty of work to do. There are different types of jobs to do. What the name of a job may no longer describe the bundle of tasks that that job comprises, but particularly in services, things like healthcare, things like cultural production, things, you know, things like education, right? Like there are the desire to automate production in those contexts looks very different for services than it might in a context like manufacturing. And there is quite clearly like just an immense amount of need in the care economy, in healthcare, et cetera. So I don't know, everyone should become a nurse maybe. You know, we talked about this at lunch today, right? Like there are obviously very strong concerns within universities about how it is that we ought to be teaching our students, what's the skill set that's most important for the new economy, what jobs ought people pursue. I am not a sage on that, but my own take is that, you know, this will sound trite, but like a well-rounded education that takes into account the social and institutional structures within which technology is deployed, like it's hard to imagine that work being fully automated away. I teach in an information school at Cornell. It sounds like we're doing sort of similar things as what folks up here are doing in terms of thinking about technology, not merely as a tool to be deployed, but with a critical eye towards when and where to deploy it and how to deploy it in ways that it is actually usable, et cetera. And so those skills to me feel pretty evergreen. But maybe that's just my desire for job security.
No, I agree basically, on both the major points, on the resilience of the social implications of the jobs disappearing are such that the concern we should have would be about what kind of authoritarian society and what kind of upheaval that eventuality will happen. That doesn't answer what you do in the next 5 years if you're a student. That's a harder question. And I think, for better or worse, you really focus on learning as quickly as possible how to leverage the new capabilities to be the best researcher you can be at whatever it is that you're doing. And that's the most immediate thing. But mostly I just agree.
So I'm going to end on a bit more of a positive question. This one stuck out to me. Can you say something good about AI?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, do you want to go first?
I thought I just did. I find, it's transformed the way I do research. I think it's just a mistake to imagine that it's all hype and there's not a dramatic new tool set. I worry about all sorts of things that people worry about, but it's a really incredibly, give me a morning with Comrade Claude and Comrade Chat, and I've learned what I might have needed a month with a team of RAs. Now the question is teaching the RAs to then do the same thing and then increase even more is significant. That's the source of the threat, but incredible tool set.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree. I don't consider myself like an AI skeptic really at all. I think, as we discussed, right, so much is in the way that we institutionalize the use of these tools, guard against the harms. I mean, all technologies have benefits and harms. That's just the way it goes, right? That's the truth. What's true for the internet, it's true for the car, it's true for nuclear power, it's true for every technology. I think anybody who tries to convince you that something is all good or all bad is just being overly simplistic or has a different agenda. I think we do better research when we recognize, our scholarship is better when we recognize the validity and the utility of these tools. The question is just how do we build around them, right? How do we want them to be situated in society such that more people benefit from their capabilities? And that, to me, is the interesting set of questions to confront.
Thank you. Thank you. So We are wrapping up. You're encouraged to join us downstairs to continue this conversation. There's a reception. A key word here is complimentary refreshments. To learn more about the iSchool, you know where the internet is. But right now, as I say goodbye, please join me in thanking our moderator, Vera, and our two incredible guest speakers, Yochai and Prof.